Hey everyone, welcome to Toxic Minerals and Plants. So there is no chapter in our textbook about toxic plants. We did discuss minerals and how some of them can be toxic at a higher level. So we'll talk a little bit about, obviously we can't cover everything, but some that are very common exposures to these toxic minerals and plants. And I have included an online or PDF textbook about toxicity and toxic substances and stuff. So if you're more interested in some of these topics, you can definitely go ahead and reference that textbook. But again, it's not required for the class. So what are we going to be talking about today? We're going to talk about how animals can access these toxic substances. So where do they find them? How do they get exposed to them? And then we'll talk about a couple toxic minerals, some we've already touched base on, and then we'll spend some time with some toxic plants. And I'm going to spend a little more time on some toxic plants that you may or may not be familiar with. I know a lot of house plants are very common to know about toxicity with your domestic animals, but I'm going to try to focus a little bit more on plants that are kind of outside, maybe near or in enclosures that animals can have access to. And then we'll talk at the end a bit about treatment options. One, are there treatment options and what do they look like? So first, let's talk about that access to the toxic substances. So, we're going to be talking mostly about captive, domesticated wild animals. That pretty much covers it. Domesticated, indoor animals such as cats and dogs, we won't cover quite as much because there's so much literature or so much stuff you can Google about, toxic house plants and things like that. So I won't cover too much about that. So these guys are usually outside, they're captive animals, domesticated animals outside, or they're wild animals. That's kind of what we're going to focus on. So toxic plants can be in or around the housing or environment of an animal. So if they're captive animals, domestic animals, wherever they are housed, there can be toxic plants in or around that housing, but also just in the environment as well, right? So many of these toxic plants are either native or have been brought here and are commonly found in the environment. Also, they can find toxic substances in feed or prey. So we'll touch a little bit about that. I have a picture here on kind of the biomagnification of some of these toxic levels in fish and birds of prey that eat the fish that have higher and higher concentrations of the toxin. But you can also find it in water as well. So water toxins are also fairly common, and we'll touch a little bit on that as well. So there's something to keep in mind when we're talking about toxic substances, and this is something just in general to really keep in mind when you think that there's a possibility of intoxication or exposure to a toxin. So exposure to a toxic substance is not necessarily equal to intoxication. Now, what does that mean? Intoxication actually means that the substance had to have been absorbed into the body and delivered to the site of action at a concentration that's actually high enough to actually give you a physiological response, okay? So there's kind of this graph, just kind of a general graph, right? There's a linear toxic response, but then also you have to remember that some things may be more toxic, so even at lower levels can elicit a toxic response. and things that may not be quite as toxic, that really require a very high concentration or high dose to become very toxic. So there's kind of this wide range as well. It doesn't necessarily mean if they ate something that they're going to die, right, or have a very severe physiological response. There also has to be proof of ingestion, right? So say you have, a plant that's in an enclosure that you didn't notice before or whatever, and you discover that it's toxic, and maybe there's some leaves missing or something, but you don't know for sure if the animal actually ate that plant, right? So there has to be some sort of proof of ingestion. And that's where we can talk about a little bit in the treatment side of it as well. So think about that, and we'll save it for later, okay? So something else to keep in mind, and especially when we're talking about, a nutrition class, but even just in the veterinary world as well, the most important routes of toxicants, how they get into the system, are either via an oral access or a dermal access, meaning they're absorbed orally. The animal ate the plant or ate the mineral and is absorbed via the GI tract, or it was on the surface of the skin, right? So it was absorbed via the skin. So those are kind of your two most important routes of exposure and routes of absorption. And you also have to consider the rate of absorption is different for the different types of exposure. So obviously things are much quicker to be absorbed if they go straight into the bloodstream, right, intravenously, or even if they're breathed in into the lungs, go straight into the capillaries of the lungs. So those are kind of your top two, highest rates of absorption. And then intramuscular, right? So injections, things like that into the muscle can be quite fast as well. And then you're talking about oral and cutaneous, meaning through the skin. So those are kind of your bottom two or your lowest rates of absorption when you're talking about these different routes of exposure. So it may take a lot longer for the absorption to happen, right? So we've touched on biomagnification a little bit already, but it's really the buildup of toxins in a food chain. So as you get higher up those trophic feeding levels, you get a higher level of the toxin in that animal. So this is really important for, top predators, right, that are really feeding at the highest trophic level. And so we'll talk a little bit more about mercury in fish, and you kind of hear about this, right? The bigger fish have, the higher concentrations of mercury, and we have to be careful about that as humans for human consumption, but also animals as well. So, birds of prey and larger predators in the ocean as well can be exposed to this higher mercury concentration. So biomagnification is also something to think about when you're talking about toxic substances in the environment and in our food chains. So let's start off with some toxic minerals. We've already started talking about mercury, but we're also going to cover lead. So these are two of the most common toxins kind of in the environment that our animals and as humans were exposed to. So we talked a little bit about, other toxic minerals at high levels in the environment, but these two we're going to focus on for this lecture. So let's first talk about lead poisoning. It's one of the oldest known kind of metal intoxications, right? So lead has been around for a long time, and we use lead in a lot of different things, right? So we used to use it in paint, fuel, things like that, no longer we really don't use it as much. So there's a diminished risk with the reduction of lead-based products that we've been using. But we still find it out there, right? So we still find paint and fuel, batteries, right? Fishing weights, things that are contaminated, such as forage and soil that that have lead contamination. So we still see some sources of high levels of lead in the environment, as well as in some of these products. So what species can be affected by lead, right? So cattle, horses, dogs, birds of prey, and waterfowl are really the ones that we see the most affected by lead intoxication. Less so, we see cats, goats, sheep, and chickens. They're less commonly affected. And interestingly enough, pigs are actually quite insensitive to lead intoxication. So we don't see pigs being affected too much by lead intoxication. So there are different ways that these guys are being exposed to lead. Obviously here you see some cattle licking a battery, birds of prey eating things that have been killed by, lead-based bullets and things like that. So we do see some of these classic exposures to lead intoxication. So what happens when we see animals that have had lead intoxication? What are the symptoms? So in all species, we have a common symptom of anorexia, meaning loss of appetite and depression. So that's common amongst all of the species. And then there are certain species-specific symptoms, such as in cattle, you see some neurological symptoms, blindness, circling, head pressing. So that's what this calf is doing in the picture, is it's pressing its head up into the corner of the stall. So that's kind of a classic neurological symptom. Dogs, we see more of GI symptoms, so vomiting, colic, diarrhea, and or constipation. Well, maybe not and, but or constipation. So more of the GI signs. Horses also have an interesting reaction as well. They get this laryngeal paralysis, so they're unable to swallow, and they have this kind of roaring sound going through their larynx. So the larynx is the voice box, right? So you have your voice box and your vocal cords, and so if there's paralysis, you get this strange kind of sound when they breathe, and they're unable to swallow. Colic is also kind of a classic sign for any problem with a horse. Birds, you get kind of this, again, general anorexia, weakness, but specifically they get this kind of leg and wing weakness, so they have droopy wings. So you can see this bald eagle up there with the droopy wings. And ataxia, so weird movement, right? Kind of some neurological signs. Their head is depressed, right? So kind of some classic signs in birds. So now let's talk about mercury. So we talked a bit about biomagnification of mercury in those kind of top predatory fish such as tuna, swordfish, where you get higher and higher levels of concentration of this organic mercury called methyl mercury in our food chains. But there's also inorganic mercury, mercury salts such as mercuric cyanide, which can be used kind of as a poison, has been used for murder in the past. So this is also a form of mercury that you have to be aware of as well. Maybe not as important in the environment, right? Also elemental mercury. So this also is no longer really as relevant or important, but quicksilver, which is liquid metallic mercury, such as in old thermometers. So if you broke a thermometer, right, with this liquid metallic mercury, it's not so much a problem via ingestion or skin contact, but it's actually absorbed via vapor inhalation. So it vaporizes and you can inhale it, and it can be toxic that way. So what kind of species are affected? We've talked a bit about the biomagnification, so predator species such as humans and seals and birds of prey. But also a big one that we are warned about, and anyone that is pregnant becomes aware of mercury as well. But in developing fetuses, it tends to concentrate and can interfere with a lot of developing especially developing neurologic tissue. So it can interfere with metabolic activity, but it also causes kind of a degeneration and necrosis in a lot of tissues. But really it's the neurologic tissue in the fetuses that are more susceptible, such as the brain. So you get this problem with the neurons in the developing fetus. So something to definitely be aware of in pregnant humans, but also other pregnant species as well. So what are some symptoms of mercury intoxication? So if you really think, it's affecting the neurological system, you get this kind of neurological manifestation of symptoms. So blindness, ataxia, incoordination, that's kind of similar to ataxia, this kind of, staggering movements, tremors, abnormal behavior, even convulsions and death. Developing animals, right? So you have this cerebellar ataxia where they can't really move very well, and also death. And interestingly enough, if you have ever seen, Alice in Wonderland and the Mad Hatter character, it's actually based in some historical truth where hats were actually made from these pelts that were cured with mercury. So it was kind of a curing process for the pelts that were made into hats, and hatters actually inhaled a lot of fumes, mercury fumes, and even mill workers. And so they suffered from mercury poisoning, which caused this kind of neurological damage. And part of that was confusion in speech, distorted vision. So they became these kind of crazed people before they eventually died, which is very sad. But it's kind of an interesting historical fact, and where they got the idea for the Mad Hatter in Alice in Wonderland. All right, so we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk the rest of the lecture on toxic plants, and then we'll finish up with treatment. So obviously there's so many toxic plants out there. I'm just going to cover a couple that, maybe are common in our area, and common, for maybe larger animals or animals outside, in enclosures, in captivity, domesticated animals. So first we'll talk about Bracken fern, which is the lower left corner picture. So fern, right, that you would normally see. Red maple, Oleander, which is the white flower in the bottom right. Avocados, obviously we know what avocados are. A lot of people don't know that avocados can be toxic. Fiddleneck, which is the two pictures of the yellow plant there with kind of a curl in it. We'll talk about fiddleneck along with a couple other plants that have high levels of this toxin, pyrazidine alkaloids. So we'll talk about them. And then last but not least, deadly nightshade. Obviously, it's in the title. It's quite poisonous, but it is, interestingly enough, part of the a family of plants that we eat all the time. So let's get started with bracken fern. So bracken fern, can be used as a decorative plant, maybe found out in the wild as well, but mostly we use it, in gardens, decoratively. So usually it's maybe in or around an enclosure, probably around an enclosure. And bracken fern has a specific enzyme in it called thiaminase. And thiaminase breaks down thiamine. So thiamine is our first B vitamin. And so it actually breaks down thiamine, which causes this kind of thiamine deficiency and neurologic syndrome. Horses are probably the most affected. Cattle can be affected, but they do have a lot of thiamine production in their rumen by those microbes. So maybe they're less affected because they do have this source of thiamine. Other animals such as pigs and sheep are fairly reluctant to consume bracken fern. It must not taste very good. So it's interesting that horses and cattle will eat it. So what kind of symptoms do we see? And a lot of these toxic plants, you need kind of a buildup of the toxin. So there could be a longer term or chronic exposure of eating the plant. So such as horses, after a month maybe about eating the plant, you see weight loss, along with a normal appetite. So even though they're eating normally, they are losing weight. And you see this kind of incoordination, ataxia, those neurologic signs, as well as recumbency and death within a couple of days without treatment. So can be very toxic with somewhat of a chronic exposure, but not too long compared to cattle, where they have to have a fairly long-term consumption because they have those microbes that are producing thiamine as well. But you see kind of some interesting symptoms with cattle. So same weight loss, but you also get this anemia and bloody discharge from orifices, bloody urine. And if they become intoxicated with the bracken fern toxin, you get a very high mortality rate. So if you start to see clinical symptoms and disease, you get a high mortality. So there's not a lot you can do for them at that point. So that's kind of sad, even though it's more of a chronic exposure. So our next plant is red maple, and this happens when usually horses, because they're the most susceptible, ingest kind of these wilted or dried maple leaves. And they need to ingest about 1 to 2 pounds of them, so it's quite a lot if you think about it. 1 to 2 pounds of dried leaves. So, if they eat a leaf or two, it's not going to affect them. And the interesting part is that the toxin is fairly unknown, or at least they haven't identified it specifically yet and said this is absolutely the toxin. But the suspect toxin is gallic acid, which causes hemolytic anemia, which means that you start destroying your own red blood cells to cause an anemia, so a low level of red blood cells. So with that, you get a slew of symptoms. So the symptoms that we see are icterus, which is kind of the yellowing of the mucous membranes, jaundice in humans, which is a high bilirubin content that causes that, cyanosis, so they're not oxygenating well, depression, dehydration, You also get hemoglobin in the urine. So hemoglobin, because you're destroying those red blood cells, so they call it hemoglobinuria, where the hemoglobin is coming out in the urine. So it's not necessarily whole red blood cells that are in the urine, it's just the hemoglobin, but that's what makes red blood cells red. You also get this respiratory distress and a high heart rate, which is called tachycardia, because they're so anemic that they can't carry the oxygen around their body to oxygenate their tissue. So they're trying to compensate by increasing their respiratory and heart rate. So these are some pictures. Sorry, they're a little fuzzy. They're not from me, but just to show the hemoglobin in the urine. Looks like bloody urine, and they're getting fluids. So our next plant is oleander, and I'm sure you guys have seen oleander, whether you recognized it or not. It's very commonly used in the middle of our freeways, those bright pink and white flowers, quite large plants. That's oleander. And a lot of people use it as decorative plants. And so this is a common one that might be near an enclosure or, even inside an enclosure as well. So oleander is very common around here. And I think people just don't realize just how poisonous or how toxic oleander is. All animals are susceptible to oleander toxicity because it contains a cardiac glycoside. And what that does is it actually blocks the sodium-potassium pumps, these ATPase pumps of cell membranes in excitable tissues, such as your heart muscle, and other muscles, right, your skeletal muscle, but mostly we see it as affecting the heart muscle. So your cells are excitable and have this depolarization happening to excite the tissue, and if you're blocking that pump to cause that depolarization, then you get a lot of problems. So what kind of symptoms do we see? So obviously we see cardiovascular problems, so decreased heart rates and arrhythmias. So if you're having trouble depolarizing those muscle cells, you cannot get a normal rhythm. And so this is just showing an arrhythmia at the bottom where you don't have a constant heartbeat, right? So you're going to decrease the heart rate and cause weird rhythms. This is then going to cause weakness, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, and sudden death as well because it is so toxic. I want to say 1 leaf of ingestion would kill a human. It's something like that. It's very, very toxic. I've heard of people using the sticks from the plant as like marshmallow roasters, and they become intoxicated with the toxin. So it is very, very toxic, and people, I think, just don't quite realize it. Now, avocados. Who would have thought avocados are toxic to almost all animals? I love avocados, and I'm sure many of you guys do as well. But so what part of the avocado is toxic? Pretty much everything except the flesh. So we eat the flesh, right? We make guacamole, but the leaves and the bark of the tree, avocado trees, the seeds and the skin is all toxic. So that's why avocados are considered very toxic. And it actually contains this fatty acid called pyrrolizidine, and so that is the natural toxin found in avocados. So interestingly enough, we are eating the only non-toxic part of an avocado. So what are the symptoms caused by avocado toxicity? So You know, obviously this is animals maybe that are around the trees that are exposed to the leaves, the bark. Maybe they're eating the whole avocado skin and pit or seed, and then they become toxic, right? I've seen toxicity, avocado toxicity in a horse, and it is quite extensive. So it can cause necrosis, so tissue necrosis where the tissue dies, hemorrhage of mammary tissues, especially in lactating animals. It also causes myocardial necrosis, so of the heart tissue, okay, heart muscle in birds and mammals. Um, so definitely a lot of problems that we see specifically in horses. We get this swollen head symptom, and where they can't even pull their tongue back into their mouth. Their whole head is swollen and they have a hard time swallowing and even breathing. It looks almost like a snake bite when they get bit by a rattlesnake in the face. Very similar reaction in their face and head and neck. And funny enough, there's a dog there eating or showing how they could eat an avocado. We had a ranch dog that loved avocados. He would pick up the avocados off the ground and just eat all the avocados. And I'm surprised he never got any problems, but he was probably smart enough to just eat the flesh of the avocado. He never ate the seeds or the skin or the leaves. He had a beautiful coat. He was a beautiful golden retriever and never had a problem. So we do see respiratory distress and that swelling, the subcutaneous edema, like I was talking about in horses. Cyanosis as well, where you don't get oxygenated tissue. That kind of goes with the necrosis. But you can also see death as well if they have enough of exposure to the toxin. So the next group of plants I'll talk about, I included fiddleneck on the list because it's one of the more common ones we see around here, but common groundsel as well. So the first picture is ragwort or Senecio. The second picture is the common groundsel. A lot of you have probably seen that. It has little yellow flowers, but then it has like the poof of the seeds when it seeds. Also, as like clover, so clover, not all species of clover, but specifically this one that has kind of the pinkish white flower. And then fiddleneck is the top right corner. So these are weeds. You see them growing on the hillsides in amongst the grass. And usually they're not very palatable, meaning most animals will avoid them if they are grazing, but they can be incorporated into hay or even complete feeds. And that's when it becomes dangerous because you have this concentrated amount and the animal can't necessarily pick it out of the feed. So horses and cattle are primarily the ones that are affected because they're being fed the hays and the complete feeds or even grazing, but less common so with grazing. Sheep seem to be less sensitive to PA toxicity or pyrazidine alkaloids. Obviously, I'm going to say it bad all the time, but I say pyrazidine alkaloids. It's a very hard word to say. So most people say PA toxin, okay? Pyrazidine alkaloid. But these guys all contain this this toxin, okay? So what does it look like? PA toxicity causes liver disease. So you can have kind of this acute or chronic exposure to PA toxin. So acute exposure meaning they got a hold of a large amount all at once. Okay. And what happens is they can get a lot of weight loss over a few days. They go into acute liver failure. Um, they get stomach ulcers, gastric ulcers, and even potentially rectal prolapse. So that's acute exposure. So high levels very quickly. The more common syndrome you see is the chronic syndrome. So they're eating, a little bit in the hay over time, and it builds up in their liver, causing this kind of liver necrosis, anorexia. They don't want to eat, even recumbency. And specifically, it causes this very interesting symptom called photosensitization, where their pink skin gets sunburned, essentially. So the liver produces enzymes and things that for some reason, go to the skin, and they're photosensitive, so it causes the skin to become sunburned in just normal sun exposure. And so they start sloughing off their skin in those areas of pink skin. And so, interestingly enough, my horse actually got PA toxicity, and he has a pink nose and pink legs, and his entire muzzle and nose and legs all sloughed off over a couple weeks, and it was quite awful. He had high liver values. He almost went into liver failure. So I treated him for a while, and he recovered very well, but it was tough. And again, it's usually in the hay, but if it's a chronic exposure, it's usually maybe, batches of hay from previous batches. It may not necessarily be the hay that they're eating at the time. So it's very hard to actually find the culprit of the weed, right? So it can be quite challenging to find out. But these classic signs can give you an idea of what it is. You can also do a liver biopsy to actually say, yes, this is PA toxicity. So last but not least, we'll talk about deadly nightshade. It's also called belladonna, is another name for the plant. And the top right plant is deadly nightshade. So it has these kind of black purple berries, and the foliage and the berries are extremely toxic when ingested. They contain tropane alkaloids. And so this can be atropine and scopolamine. And these guys have what are called anticholinergic properties. And it actually disrupts the entire parasympathetic nervous system. So we'll talk about that in a minute and what that means. But when you talk about deadly nightshade, I said it's part of a family of plants, the nightshade family, that we eat a lot of their berries and a lot of their fruit. So the whole picture on the bottom are all other nightshade plants. So eggplants, potatoes, bell peppers, tomatoes, tomatillos, even ground cherries. So these guys are all part of the nightshade family. And so it's interesting that one of these nightshades can be so toxic. So let's talk about what the symptoms are. So we said it has anticholinergic properties, and it disrupts the parasympathetic nervous system. So what does our parasympathetic nervous system? It's part of our autonomic nervous system. And the autonomic nervous system regulates all of our involuntary activities. So anything in our body, such as digestion, heart rate, respiratory rate, kidney function, all kinds of stuff that we don't have conscious control over is what the autonomic nervous system regulates. And specifically, we have the parasympathetic and the sympathetic. And sympathetic, think fight or flight, right? So it increases your heart rate, increases your respiratory rate to get away from danger. And then parasympathetic, you think is your rest and digest, okay? So rest and digest, you're gonna lower that heart rate, lower the respiratory rate, you're gonna digest your food, so you're going to urinate, so anything that's kind of the housekeeping kind of normal functions of your body is the parasympathetic nervous system. So what happens is this toxin is going to block the parasympathetic nervous system. So if you're blocking all those rest and digest things, your sympathetic nervous system is going to go haywire, okay? And that's your fight or flight. So essentially you're going to get these dilated pupils, tachycardia, high heart rate, staggering, headache, you get flushing, severe dry mouth, slurred speech. You get these even delirium, hallucinations, convulsions. It's crazy. So it severely affects your autonomic nervous system by blocking the parasympathetic nervous system. And so that's what anticholinergic means, is anti-parasympathetic nervous system, essentially. Okay. So crazy stuff. It also can cause narcosis, paralysis in a lot of our domestic animals. Interestingly enough, cattle and rabbits are fairly resistant, so that's quite interesting. But most animals are highly susceptible. So this, don't panic. This just shows you the different roles of the parasympathetic versus the sympathetic nervous system. So them together we refer to as the autonomic nervous system. So if you block kind of all these things on the left-hand side that are normal functions of the parasympathetic nervous system, and you're going to enhance or kind of overactivate that right side, then you can see kind of where you get some of these symptoms from this toxin. So now let's talk about some potential treatments for intoxication. So if you suspect ingestion of a toxic substance, there's usually kind of a couple of general treatments that we like to do. You don't know how much they've ingested. You don't know maybe even which toxic substance they ingested, but it can be a problem, right, if you don't take action. So the first and foremost thing you want to try to prevent is absorption, right? So especially if they've ingested it, you want to stop the absorption in the stomach. And that's really one of the most critically important management treatments of intoxication. And there's two ways we generally go about doing that. So gastric decontamination, you can give them something that's going to bind the toxin, such as activated charcoal. So that is something that you can pump into their stomach to try to bind that toxin before it gets absorbed. But in certain species, you can also try to elicit vomiting, which will increase elimination of the toxin. So hopefully they can vomit up the majority of the substance that they ingested. So those are two big ways of trying to prevent absorption. And then obviously there's a slew of kind of supportive therapies for various different toxins. So Obviously, they all have slightly different symptoms, and so if you do know what was ingested, hopefully you're able to counteract some of those symptoms of that toxin. So if the toxin does become absorbed, which there's a good chance of that, unless you're very on top of the first line of defense, trying to decrease absorption, the liver is the organ that is primarily involved in the metabolism of toxins. So normally it'll probably go to the liver for processing. And so your liver is going to try to detoxify that toxin and try to eliminate it from the body. So obviously how fast your liver is able to detoxify it depends on the individual, the species, and the physiological status. So what it's trying to do is it tries to turn it into a water-soluble product. So most toxins are fat-soluble, and then you try to turn it into something water-soluble that can be eliminated from the body via the GI tract or the urinary tract. So you're going to try to get it into the gallbladder, into the bile, into the GI system, or you're going to try to get it into the kidneys and out in urine. Okay. So there are some treatments to try to make a toxin more water soluble, which is going to help enhance the elimination of the toxin from the body. And the two major routes we're talking about is fecal elimination and urinary elimination. So depending on the toxin, you can also try to get it out via saliva, the respiratory system, even milk. Bile kind of falls in the same category as fecal, so that kind of is the same. But our major routes of elimination are fecal and urinary. So what are we trying to do to increase this elimination? So if we're talking about fecal elimination, it's very important because most of these toxins are ingested, right? So we said it's going in the stomach. Hopefully we can increase the elimination in the stool. So we talked about activated charcoal as being an option for trying to stop the absorption, but it also increases the fecal output as well. But there are laxatives and cathartics that we can use as well, which increase elimination via different pathways. So, laxatives are maybe a little nicer. Cathartics are quite strong laxatives to evacuate the entire colon, and it can be quite strong. But you can also do whole bowel irrigation as well. Maybe not an option for some species. But then we also can try to get it out via the urine, right? So we can filter it and secrete it in the urine depending on the size and the pH of the toxin. So if you know it's going to be eliminated in the urine, you can increase the pH. So you can manipulate the pH of the urine to try to enhance urinary elimination. So there's certain things you can do to try to increase urinary clearance. So you don't have to know any of the specifics about how pH affects urinary excretion, but this is just one example. So on our y-axis, we have the amount of methamphetamine that's being excreted in the urine, and then the time on the x-axis. So if you make the urine more acidic, you're going to increase the excretion of that methamphetamine. And vice versa. If you make it more alkaline, then you decrease excretion. So it just depends on the toxin and things like that. So, but there are some examples where, manipulating the pH of the urine can help with urine excretion. So even though fecal and urinary excretion is probably the most common, there are some other treatments that can be done to try to increase elimination via other routes. So biliary kind of goes along with the GI tract, but larger toxins do get absorbed in the GI tract and go to the liver, right, through the portal circulation. And then it can be excreted as bile. Okay, so that's one way to help increase excretion is through bile, but the bile ends up in the GI tract anyway, so then you're going to excrete it in the fecal matter as well. So this is just a different route to get into the GI tract. So that's biliary excretion. If we're talking about gases, we can increase respiratory excretion, the diffusion of gases, and it just depends on the solubility of the gas. So that may not be as important for our situation. But also milk. So we can excrete toxins in milk, which can be a concern for nursing animals, as well as public health. If we're talking about, cow's milk, that could be a problem if they're exposed to some sort of toxin and they are being used in the dairy industry. This can be a public health concern. Because what happens is you can get ion trapping where the milk actually has a lower pH than blood serum, and that can trap a toxin into the milk instead of the bloodstream. And we also see lipid-soluble toxins that will go through the milk as well because they're fat-soluble instead of water-soluble. So this can be a concern and something that the dairy industry has to monitor very closely, and why it's important to test the milk too for different toxins, because it can be a route of elimination. All right, so that's it for toxic minerals and plants. Of course, there are so many more interesting toxic plants and minerals out there. If you want more on toxic plants, definitely check out the PDF textbook that I also included on Canvas for you guys. So next week we're going to talk about kind of methods of feeding, presentation of food, things like that in our next week lecture. So if you have any questions, let me know. Feel free to message me or stop by at office hours. All right, thanks a lot.